Welcome back to another exciting discussion here on the Champions Path, a platform for all things simulation and training based, designed for our champions in the military, law enforcement, and other critical first responder roles. With me today is the world famous Lisanne Kleygrewe, a postdoctoral research associate at the Vrije University in Amsterdam, where she leads and contributes to various research projects within police, military, and sporting sectors. Today, we'll focus our discussion on her dissertation titled Immersed in Training, Advancing Police Practice with Virtual Reality. Good morning, Lisanne,
Good
and welcome.
morning. I thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Yeah, I'm really excited. It's 8 a.m. here in North Carolina. I'm on my first cup of coffee. I'm usually at my intellectual peak after at least 3 cups of coffee, so I have my wife on speed dial in preparation for refills. As we have some great topics to discuss. So before we do, if you wouldn't mind going into a brief summary of how you became interested in human performance in the specific domains, and what work are you currently involved in?
Yeah. So actually, that started when I was super young. I used to play football on quite a high level. So that included from the youth national training selection teams in Germany to then higher up. And I moved to the US with a football scholarship, well, a US soccer scholarship. And I was fascinated with psychology and playing football at the same time. And so I was always curious how people could perform in these high pressure settings. Also, when we were doing penalty kicks in a shootout tournament or something like that, I was curious why somebody could do it better than other people, what factors were influencing
Mm-hmm.
performance. And so I decided to study psychology in my master's. And that was then a focus on performance and sports psychology. And I was also curious not only about the sport implementation of that, but particularly police and military, because as you know, the
Mm-hmm.
implications of decision makings are just so different. And I was curious how people can put themselves in situations where there's a threat to themselves, there's potentially a threat to others, and there's bystanders around it, and how they're still able to perform these actions that they're required to. And I
Mm-hmm.
really was curious about how we can train that, how we can improve that through training. And that's how my research journey started. I started then working together with the Dutch National Police here in Amsterdam, conducting research on psychological competencies and how those are being assessed so that police officers are able to perform well also when having a firearm on the street. And that was the beginning of really diving into police research.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw and witnessed a lot of police training. I was also involved in a lot of assessment of skills. And then I realized, you know what? The efforts that are going into setting up these trainings are amazing and it requires so many resources. Is there a way that we can maybe make this a little bit easier or different? And
Mm-hmm.
that's where virtual reality came in as a training solution to save some resources and also to simulate a variety of different situations. Because, particularly here in Europe, with different law enforcement agencies, we see that scenario based training in real life is so resource intense and time consuming that a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times we don't get the training benefits out of it that we should. And with virtual reality, we were then thinking, hey, maybe we can use that as a tool to simulate a
Mm-hmm.
variety of different situations safely and also hopefully a little bit more effectively.
Yeah, that's exciting, and the questions that you seek within your 149-page dissertation are essentially the theme around our discussion today, and it's broken down into 6 chapters. We've got the general introduction, police training in practice, organization and delivery according to European law enforcement agencies, virtual reality training for police officers, a comparison of training responses in VR and real life training. No pain, no gain? Question mark, which is incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, the effect of adding a pain stimulus in virtual training for police officers, and there's some really great products out there. Stress vests, AU
Yeah.
fire accuracy under fire, neurostimulation systems and kits. So I'm really looking forward to diving into that chapter. And then chapter 5, changing perspectives, enhancing learning efficacy with the after action review in virtual reality training for police. And then chapter 6, the epilogue. So with those questions, that's surrounding our theme today, as well as your dissertation. How can VR training improve and supplement current training practices, and how can VR training be applied to enhance the training and learning experiences of police officers? I think that's incredibly important, and I'm really interested to see the science and research side and the data that can support enhancing police training using virtual reality. So, in the general introduction, I do want to start off the discussion with a quote. Quote: "Next to physical skills such as running, weapons handling, shooting, and self-defense, police officers need to possess psychological skills such as information processing, problem solving, de-escalation, and decision making." End quote. And I don't have, as we discussed, I don't have a law enforcement background. However, I do have military and private sector security in high threat environments within the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And I see a lot of crossover knowledge, skills, and behavior requirements between all three domains. And you're really setting the stage by segmenting the importance of physical knowledge and physical skills knowledge and behaviors, and psychological knowledge, skills, and behavior. And I believe that if we don't understand the what, why, and how of training, then we won't be able to answer how can VR training improve training practices. So what are your thoughts around the general introduction and this quote?
Yeah, so particularly with this quote, I just really wanted to show that there's a variety, such a vast amount of variety of skills that police officers, military personnel, all these people working and operating in these high risk situations that they need to possess, and that we can't just train each of them in isolation. They all occur bundled together, right? You can't just have like the physical skill of weapon handling without making a proper decision, processing information. So to me, these skills that you need to have, you need to be able to perform them holistically in an operational environment. So while you're on a static shooting range, you might be a really great shot, but then you're in a high pressure operational environment where there's other factors that you have to take into account. So it's not really this isolated static situation that is oftentimes trained. It's really this holistic view that needs of behaviors and skills that needs to also be taken into account in training. And that's really the setup in choosing a VR system and designing virtual environments, because we have the option in VR to simulate pretty much whatever we want. So then we need to really make decisions based on, okay, what is it that we want to train? What is necessary? What is similar to what we want our people to be able to do in operational situations? So that was really also the onset with this introduction of my dissertation, showing that what police officers need to know is basically not just a single entity of a variety of different isolated skills. They have to come together, and you have to be able to perform them in conjunction.
Yeah, great point. Especially static shooting, paper targets on the range versus shooting and hitting targets in combat are completely different. And what you're describing really, in essence, reminds me of John Boyd's OODA loop, and OODA, OODA. It's observe, orient, decision, and action. And it's a simplistic framework for rapidly understanding a situation. And for me, breaking down complex psychological concepts into easy, understandable flows really helps me retain the information. So, what you're describing is similar to that OODA loop, right? So you observe, you're processing relevant information through quick, active observation. Orient, you're tactically gaining the advantage through offensive posturing, whether that be closing the distance, gaining cover and concealment, right? The metaphorical high ground. And then flowing into decision, right, through rules of engagement or standard operating procedures. It should be a simple process of determining what action should be taken. And then in the OODA loop is action, right? And you really only have four options, which is what you mentioned in the first half of the statement, right? Running, self-defense, weapons handling, and shooting, and those come into play. And it's all your foos, right? You have your tongue foo, kung fu, gun fu, and then run fu. Yeah,
Yeah.
you talk. Yeah, training and practicing tung fu, the communications aspects, and whether that's communicating to an individual, uh, whether that be issuing commands, de-escalation conversations, or you're talking with your partners or your team, and then you have kung fu. You're physically engaging in non-lethal hand-to-hand, what have you. Gun fu, utilizing deadly force. And then your last option is run fu, right? So you can just leave. And it's like you had mentioned, it's important in a training scenario or a training environment to not isolate any one of these individual skill sets outside of initial training, and being able to train in a simulated environment utilizing all of these physical skill sets, knowledge, and behaviors, as well as the psychological.
Absolutely.
And that really, what drives training? It's the what and why, right? What are the knowledge, skills, and behaviors required? Why are they required? And then how can we bridge the gap by teaching these principles in a, you know ideally in a crawl, walk, run, uh, with increased complexity methods in a very efficient manner. And that's what's so interesting about your dissertation is the explanation, or the research around the efficacies of training using virtual reality. So I do want to go into the later half of your general introduction, which are the three foundational models used in your research. And my perspective downstream from the science, as an end user, I definitely see the value realized from stress inoculation, realistic representation of the operational setting in a virtual simulated environment, as well as a trickle charge or a drip method of teaching, to prime short-term memory through that crawl, walk, run method of increased complexity, and of course recurring training for long-term mastery. So I'd like to turn it over to you, and definitely keeping in mind the question of why is this important to the research presented within the remaining chapters of the dissertation. So the three models are integrated model of perceptual motor performance and anxiety, representative learning design, and cognitive load theory. So Lisanne, what the heck is integrated model of perceptual motor performance and anxiety?
Yeah. Before we get to that, maybe a quick
Okay.
explanation as to why this was relevant for us to lay a foundation that is based
Mm-hmm.
in theory. I think in general, oftentimes there might be a problem coming up in practice, and a lot of times we do already have some sort of solution or some starting point that we can find in a theoretical foundation. And then to not just have theory stand on itself, we need to connect it back to practice. So what we're aiming to do with our research here in our research team at the VU is to really make a connection between theory and practice and integrate that as well. So the knowledge that we can gain from these theoretical models that you mentioned and that lay the
Mm-hmm.
foundation for the upcoming work in my dissertation. That's really the starting point for us to see, okay, what elements are important for VR training for us? How can we improve performance with these models? What do they already say? And how might they actually differ, or how might the implications of the model differ in virtual
Mm-hmm.
reality? Because that would also then bring up new questions for us to do research on in the future, if there are differences between real life performance and VR performance, or what we learn within these environments.
Mm-hmm.
So as you mentioned, the first model is the integrated model of perceptual motor performance and anxiety. This one is quite interesting because it really dives into performance under pressure and how people are able to make decisions in these situations. And in the model, you have very many incoming inputs, basically. So any personal contextual characteristics of the situations that flow in. And then generally you can imagine that a person has an anxiety response. And
Mm-hmm.
when that happens, when arousal levels are high, oftentimes the perceptual attention that goes to information processing goes to information that is not necessarily relevant to solve the task at hand. So instead of focusing on me solving a case, or there's an armed offender and I want to focus really specifically on how can I stop this or how can I de-escalate with either
Mm-hmm.
use of force or communication. But instead of focusing my attention on that, I might be distracted by bystanders because my levels of arousal are already so high and I can't really focus on just my task. So
Mm-hmm.
then based on this model, we can reduce this by investing additional mental effort. Through this mental effort, we can then focus our attention just on task relevant information. And then our decision making processes are much clearer and we can focus on what we need to
Mm-hmm.
do with our task. So the implications of this model are really, particularly in my dissertation, focused on this investment of mental effort and how that happens. Um, as we later probably will talk about this has been shown to be different in virtual reality than in real life. And that was a
Mm-hmm.
really, really interesting implication also in designing and choosing VR solutions for training, particularly for performing under pressure.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let me see if I can, I guess, regurgitate what you said, just for my understanding. Right, you're essentially talking about stress inoculation or desensitizing to stress by giving or allowing trainees to be in environments that give the trainees the experience to the psychological and physiological reactions of high stressful situations, high risk situations. Therefore, uh, hoping in operational settings, the operational response would foster abilities to make calculated, relevant, and speed the critical decision making process.
Correct. So basically, what we're
Mm-hmm.
aiming to do in this model is really, you can lay it as a foundation for stress training. And
Mm-hmm.
if the more people are in these stressful situations, the more they learn to familiarize themselves with their stress responses. So if I'm
Mm-hmm.
in training in a situation like that, I can learn knowingly that I'm not in danger, how my
Mm-hmm.
body responds, where my attention goes, how my heartbeat is increasing or decreasing depending on the threat that is available or in the environment. And based
Mm-hmm.
on that, this familiarization with this response, we're hoping that shifting of attention to task relevant
Mm-hmm.
information in an operational environment will happen.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So maybe not necessarily desensitization, but more managing
Yeah,
stress response.
exposure. Yeah.
Let's roll into representative learning design. What is that?
To put it very briefly, what we're trying to do by that is basically for training design, also for training design of a virtual environment, we want to sample constraints or elements of an operational environment so that we can train in a representative, so in a realistic setting. So depending on what your aim of the training is, let's say we want to train de-escalation communication skills, then we look at experiences of police officers in real operational situations, and then we kind of try to replicate these elements that happen within that. That can
Mm-hmm.
also be from a situational perspective, but also what the person in front of them and the context of the situation actually was. We can sample these different constraints, we can bring them into the virtual environment, and that allows
Mm-hmm.
us to really be able to manipulate different elements to make training realistic and give
Mm-hmm.
officers exposure to different things that they might be or might not experience
Mm-hmm.
in real life. And they also then have the chance to explore different solutions to these problems.
Mm-hmm. And is that focusing on the psychological fidelity of the systems, not necessarily, visual or audio fidelity?
I think it is very holistic, so it should encompass
Mm-hmm.
all. So that
Okay.
starts from being able to physically move in the environment as you
Mm-hmm.
would in an operational setting. So the
Mm-hmm.
system needs to be able to, yeah, supply these type of movements availabilities. But also, for instance, if we do de-escalation, we want to, in a police setting, we want to be able to have the at least the decision-making abilities to
Mm-hmm.
choose any use of force that might be necessary. So, from a hardware perspective, we need to be able to have not only the firearm, but also the pepper spray, the baton, the taser, whatever in an operational situation the person is equipped with, the police officer is equipped with, so that we have the choice in a situation to actually use this. Because if we only have the firearm to de-escalate, well, then we only have two options, and then decision making is a very different process than if we have all our options that we would have in an operational setting. So those are also considerations there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So movement, tool fidelity, physical movement, visual audio, communication and interactions with virtual NPCs, and then the psychological fidelity.
Yeah.
All right. Let's dive into cognitive load theory.
That's probably my favorite, I have to say.
Okay.
Yeah, cognitive load theory. So this was quite super interesting also in the context of virtual reality. But first, just the theory in and of itself. Basically, you can imagine, or we probably all know, that we have a limited working memory capacity. We can't just remember a bunch of things at the same time throughout the day. There's only little chunks of information that we can store in short-term memory. And the problem with that is that we want to use our short-term memory and focus that attention that we have within that, the capacity that we do have, on relevant information. A lot of the time in training design, it happens that there's elements in the training that might be too complex for the person at the time to then have a positive learning effect. They can't retain all the information that is necessary in this moment in time, and then we lose a lot of the space that we have for learning. So within this cognitive load theory, there's different elements of load that are relevant for designing learning environments, or in our case, training environments in VR, and how we can manipulate them to almost lead to the desired cognitive load. And with this theory, particularly in my dissertation, we first even wanted to look at how that might differ from real life training to VR training and what implications that has.
Yeah. Do you have an example of, why this is important concept in developing training scenarios in VR simulation systems?
Absolutely. So we've seen this particularly in my research that I've done. I measured particularly mental effort as a measure of the effort that people have to exert when they're training in a virtual environment. And we've seen that generally this load of mental effort is really, really high, much higher compared to real life training. And we've also found out that this, based on the first model that I've talked about, the integrated perceptual motor learning and anxiety, in comparison to that, we've seen that this mental effort is not only used to reduce stress responses, but it's also used to navigate the virtual environment. So we add, on top of stressful and dealing with stressful situations in VR, we also add the element of, okay, now I have a different tool and I have to navigate and use this tool and spend energy and effort on how I can navigate and use this. So in VR, then we're trying to find design choices that can reduce this extra mental effort that we need to get used to the virtual environment. How do we move properly? How do I communicate with other officers or with a subject or NPC? So we use instructional design, for instance, by having familiarization period with different short sequences of scenarios to get just people used to moving in the environment before we start the training scenarios.
It's like a tutorial.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and that seems to be quite important, so that we can actually, in the training itself, focus on performing under pressure, performing our task, our operational task, and not focusing on how do I actually move in this environment.
Interesting. I enjoy playing video games. I'm familiar with technology. Did you notice a decrease in the mental effort and performance of individuals who were familiar with virtual reality, head-mounted displays? And first of all, what systems what was the hardware that you guys were using?
So I did most of my research with two different VR systems. One was supplied by Relion. They worked in military, now also police context, also fire department. but we developed within a huge EU project. We developed the now called Blue Suit. So
Hmm.
from the original black suit, the military ops suit, we developed a police solution, and that is
Hmm.
also full body system. Actually, I don't know the specifics on the technology, but yeah, it's the
Okay.
Relion system. And
Okay.
then we also use the Refence system. They're based in Switzerland, and they also have a full body motion capturing system. This
Hmm.
one was originally based was originally used for gaming, so professional gaming,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then also redesigned to be able to use in police and also different. Now I think they're going also into different first responder
Hmm.
solutions.
Okay. So going back to my question, did you analyze and see a decrease in mental effort from individuals who were either gamers or familiar with the hardware?
Yeah, interestingly, we actually really wanted to look at that because we also had the same suspicion. And there we
Hmm.
did see that people who have a high gaming frequency,
Hmm.
um, were very familiar with playing any type of games. This could be computer games or other, yeah,
Hmm.
technology enhanced games. That they didn't need to invest as much mental effort, even as a first time user in virtual reality.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this could have also interesting implications for police training. If I have a group
Hmm.
of young people who I know have a lot of gaming experience, I might design my training differently than I would if I have an older group of, almost near to retirement
Hmm.
officers that might not have this gaming experience. Then
Hmm.
I might have a different instructional design for my scenario
Hmm.
setup and different types of tutorials.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I was in a very similar situation on the end user side. I was giving a period of instruction on a virtual reality, law enforcement virtual reality system. And one of the participants, one of the trainees, didn't have a smartphone. He still had one of the flip phones,
Mm,
and
nice.
the yeah. So it was incredibly challenging to get this individual utilizing the system in the maximum effort and in the most efficient way when he had challenges with simple smartphones, which
Yeah.
is why he retained his flip phone. So interesting, and I suspect that with the newer generations, entering the law enforcement field, replacing the older generation, being more familiar with the software, the hardware, the mental effort. I'm sure you'll see a decline in mental effort and getting
Yeah.
used to the system itself.
I think so as
Um,
well. That's an interesting
mhm,
part because we've also seen similar things with motion sickness. A lot of times it was
mm,
actually people who were unfamiliar with technology and also a
mhm,
little bit older that did
mhm,
experience more motion sickness.
mhm.
Or, yeah,
Yeah, interesting.
that's so.
I've got four children, and my eldest is 13, and her my eldest boy who's 11, and then my youngest daughter who's 8. They all have the MetaQuest 3, and
Mhm.
they'll go into the roller coaster experiences. I tried that within 5 seconds. I knew that was a huge mistake, but they'll sit there for hours and run through all sorts of motion sickness inducing experiences, and I just don't know how they do it.
Yeah, I'm still very curious
Hmm.
on cyber sickness and how that actually, like, what it is that
Hmm.
differs between people that elicits
Hmm.
these responses.
Hmm.
I think research is currently being done on that. I'm not sure on the
Hmm.
latest findings,
Yeah,
but yeah,
interesting.
super interesting field as well.
Yeah, I would like to research that too.
Yeah,
Is there anything else within the general introduction that you'd like to discuss? If not, we can go into chapter 2.
let's go into chapter two.
All right. Chapter 2, police training in practice, organization, and delivery according to European law enforcement agencies. And this chapter appears to be an evaluation of several law enforcement agencies' training
Yeah,
evolutions. And I'm very interested in learning, the scope of work, effort, and your key findings.
yeah. So basically, the onset of my dissertation and the research that has gone into VR. First, before I even started that, I wanted to see, okay, how is training even conducted currently in European law enforcement agencies? What are they doing? What is important skills that they want to teach their officers? How much time do they spend? What does that look like? So I decided to visit, various law enforcement agencies within Europe and interview police trainers and training coordinators, as well as observe their training practices. And the outcome you can see in this paper. And it was very, very interesting because I visited different countries in Europe, and you can still see that a lot of the challenges and the strengths within police training are very similar across these countries. Particularly, we found that there's a difference. Well, when we conducted an analysis, and we saw there's two different topics that came out of the interviews. One being on the side of organization of training and how that is being handled from the perspective of how many hours of training, what components of training are being given, who decides on the content of the training, that side of it, and then the delivery of the training. So what are the police trainers doing in designing their training practices? What tools are they using? How are they giving feedback, for examples? What sort of training designs are they using? So that was the scope of this. That was what I was looking at. And then we could see that actually one of the biggest problems that police officers were facing was the resource availability for creating realistic training environments. And that was, I was going to say good for us to see. It wasn't good at all in the sense of what was happening, but it was good because then we had a good in for virtual reality training, because this is something that we can actually use VR for. And that was the connecting part then.
Right. Yeah, because that's really important for your research and testing and analyzing data to answer how can VR training improve and supplement current training practices, as well as enhancing the training and learning experiences.
Exactly. Because if we had found that training is great, we actually don't need to change anything, then the rest of my research wouldn't have needed to be conducted, because if everything is fine, we might not even need virtual reality training as a tool to add to the existing training practices.
Yeah, very true, because virtual reality is just one segment of reality-based training, because you have your physical force on force and real life scenario-based training. You've got computer-based training, 2D projection-based, virtual reality, augmented reality. So it's interesting. Why did you choose, and you may have answered this, and I apologize if you did, why virtual reality as opposed to any of the other reality-based training methods?
Yeah. So when we visited these different countries, we saw that particularly the training locations was oftentimes a big issue. So a lot of times we would have police training in the exact same location that it always is being conducted. So when we're doing tactical training in searching and clearing rooms, for instance, we always go into the same rooms. We know exactly where the windows and where the doors are, but we just don't have any other options. So then a virtual reality solution, we can create endless options of rooms and buildings and layouts of these different things that we want to. So that was a topic that was very interesting to us, that we can just simulate a lot of different environments. And the other point, well, more logistical or practical point in regards to my research was that my research and my dissertation was connected to a large EU project that was funded to look into virtual reality training as a solution to improve the performance of police officers under stress in high-risk situations. So that also helped with navigating the VR route.
Right. Made it easier. Which I think this would be a perfect segue into chapter 3, because I think this is probably, it's important to me and on the minds of most of the end users, is the comparison of training responses in VR and real life training. Is there a purpose for VR in the training setting? So there were 2 scenarios discussed within this chapter: the real life experience and the VR. So do you want to go into the real life scenario, and then we can transition to the VR experience?
Yeah. So after looking at what real life training was looking like,
Mm-hmm.
and finding this nice gap where VR training would fit into. We wanted to see, okay, we technically have a use for this, but can we, because we know that performing under pressure, we want to elicit arousal, is
Mm-hmm.
VR able to do that? And so then is when this study came in, and where we compared um, yeah, virtual reality to real life training. And in the real life situation, we had Dutch police officers that had also special tasks in, I think, protection. Uh, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
protection teams. Um, they had to. They trained in teams of. The whole team had 6 to 12 people, I believe, and they trained to protect a building. So we created an outdoor, indoor, large scale, um, real life scenario with actors, where basically the setting was there's a lawyer that had to be protected, that was being or supposed to be attacked by some other people to not give information away in court.
Mm-hmm.
Then the the task of the people was to protect something that they would
Mm-hmm.
do in, yeah, in their real life operational setting in this special team.
Mm-hmm.
Then after, yeah, just scouting the environment for a while, we would have actors that come and ask to gain entry, something suspicious, something non-suspicious, and eventually we would have 2 cars driving in with yeah, with suspects that carry weapon. They start opening fire. They have smoke grenades. So it was a very big,
Mm-hmm.
large,
Oh wow.
um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Very
real life
theatrical.
scenario. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was, it was something.
Yeah.
Sure. So within these scenarios, we actually wanted to measure a variety of different training responses, physical as well
Mm-hmm.
as psychological.
How long was the training scenario from start to finish on
So
average?
this real life training scenario was on average, I think, 45 minutes.
45 minutes. Okay. And it required a lot of props, including the smoke grenades,
Yeah.
vehicles, civilians, role players, a lot
Yeah, the
of
whole location was also
planning.
on, it
Mm-hmm.
was not in use
Mm-hmm.
airport. So even renting
Okay.
that out is also, I'm sure, a
Mm-hmm.
resource that has to be taken into account.
Right, and the time and the logistical effort of finding a usable location.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch into VR scenario. Right,
Yeah.
the so like you had said, the officers were fitted with the Rely On head-mounted display. Their black suit, which consisted of the computing pack
Mhm.
and then a replica rifle.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
they have a full body suit that contains
Mm-hmm.
straps, so you have sensors on all
Mm.
major joints, so that movement is replicated realistically also
Okay.
in the environment. So then I think
Mm-hmm.
we had a, I'm saying this, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was 30 by 30 meters space where they could move within. And there we replicated also a building, a large building in the middle of the scenario, where they would also patrol in groups of 4
Mm-hmm.
and look for suspicious behavior.
Mm-hmm.
The task per se was not necessarily to protect someone, but to look out for suspicious behavior. And it was sort of in line with what the real life training scenario was also like.
Mm-hmm.
But because the benefit of VR is that we can adjust the scenario on the fly with
Mm-hmm.
in action monitoring from the outside. We had an
Mm-hmm.
operator and a police trainer who was able to manipulate different elements on the go. So
Mm-hmm.
while the officers were in the virtual reality scenario, we could put in different elements to challenge them or to maybe also decrease the level of complexity if we noticed that it was too
Mm-hmm.
much. So
Mm-hmm.
that we could, and we did do during the virtual reality scenarios.
Right. Yeah, one thing I thought of, you're talking about a 45-minute scenario in the reality based training. How long were the VR training
Yeah.
scenarios? How long did
Obviously,
those last?
we couldn't do
Yeah.
45 minutes in the VR scenario.
Right.
So we first had a fitting, then we had a tutorial scenario where people
Mm-hmm.
were just getting used to the virtual environment, how you open doors, how you move, how you use your weapon, how you communicate.
Mm-hmm.
That was, I think, about 5 minutes. And
Mm-hmm.
then we had 3 different scenarios, so that we had short immersion, then a short reflection break for feedback,
Mm-hmm.
and then re-immersion. So 3 rounds of
Okay.
that. And the scenarios within that lasted anywhere from, I think, 4 to 8 minutes each of them,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the group and how quickly they solved
Mm-hmm.
the scenario.
Yeah, interesting. So in comparison, in segments, the setup time for the reality-based training compared to the setup time in virtual reality, sounds like there's a huge advantage for virtual reality. Running through the scenarios, there was the ability to stop during the scenarios if there was any issues with the training environment. Whereas I would assume in the reality based training there wasn't that, especially with the oversight of instructors. You know, it
Yeah.
was probably a lot more intimate with the virtual reality versus the reality based training.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it
Mm-hmm.
was also in a more condensed way so that
Mm-hmm.
you could easily see who's doing what. We also, every time we train with this reline system, we have an external screen so that we can also see what's happening um, while just sitting out there. And then we have an operator station where the operator with an
Mm-hmm.
additional instructor can manipulate whatever's going on in the VR,
Mm-hmm.
so that we have a lot more control over what's happening there and how we can, yeah, make gains within our learning process.
Mm-hmm.
We can have much more of an influence from yeah, much more of an influence from outside on the training.
Mm-hmm. So I perceive that VR, it sounds like VR has a huge advantage over reality based training, but ultimately, what were the findings in eliciting similar responses within virtual reality versus the real life scenario based
Yeah.
training?
So first, I guess we can just start with the physical training responses. So we used a heart rate monitor that also had an accelerometer in it, so we could assess the movement that people did in the environments. And then we measured or extracted the heart rate, the average heart rate throughout the scenario, as well as the maximum heart rate. And we also calculated the activity levels that we had in real life training and in VR training. And particularly with the maximum heart rate, as well as with the activity levels, we've seen that in real life training, these are significantly higher. And this was to be expected
Right, makes sense.
because
Mm-hmm.
we move much more. We have to put on and take off the very heavy duty vests depending on the situation that arises. We might have to run a little bit. In VR, our participants were instructed not to run to avoid, yeah, any cyber sickness
Mm-hmm.
or any, yeah, damage to the equipment. So those were reasonable, yeah, findings that
Mm-hmm.
we expected. But this also has quite interesting implications for, yeah, later application of VR and what we want to train with it. So if we, for instance, want to train a really physically demanding, where we have to do a lot of jumping around over different hurdles and chase subjects down, we might not want to do that in
Mm-hmm.
virtual reality. Um,
Right.
I think that's pretty clear. But that was just an
Mm-hmm.
interesting finding that we had.
Right.
Then when we go to the psychological training responses, we measured the perceived levels of stress. So you can imagine that after both of the trainings, we went up to the participants with a small scale, and on the scale, they had to take a mark as to how much they perceived to be stressed in the scenarios and how much mental effort they exerted. And we compared that after, and we found that the perceived level of stress and the average heart rate were actually similar in real life and
Mm-hmm.
VR training. That was also a positive finding for us, because then we could basically see that the responses, the training responses that VR is able to elicit, are similar to real life training. And that's
Mm-hmm.
important to us, particularly in performing under pressure. So that was nice.
Mm-hmm.
And as we had talked about before, we've seen that the mental effort was significantly higher in virtual reality training compared to real life training. And that was interesting, particularly considering that the perceived levels of stress were similar. So that the mental effort that people invested additionally in VR wasn't to reduce this mental effort, because that was the same across both conditions, but it must have been because, yeah, it's a new training system, it's a new tool that you have to
Right.
get used to. So that's where this finding came up.
So there is similarities in eliciting the responses. However, it seems that it's situation or scenario specific, and to answer or part of the answer of how VR training can improve and supplement current police practices. Uh, Again, not all scenarios you would run in a virtual reality, but possibly communication and conversational training, observational and pattern recognition, critical decision making tactics, escalation, de-escalation, as an example. So very interesting findings.
Yeah.
Um, Do you have any other addition to this chapter?
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that we didn't try to compare virtual reality to real life training one to one. So we didn't
Mm-hmm.
try to replicate, because if we were to replicate it and whatever the findings are, it doesn't matter, because we're not going to replace real life training with virtual reality. We're going to
Right.
try to use virtual reality and the benefits that it has. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, you can manipulate things on the go, you can simulate a variety of situations. So we really wanted to compare the training responses based on how these tools would be used in operational training practices.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an important point to mention here.
Yeah, that is important because I also advocate that simulations training isn't an end all be all, but a supplement to traditional training practices, classroom instruction, field training exercises that replicate operational settings, and integrating virtual reality in an appropriate scenario um, can enhance that training.
Yeah, absolutely.
So great point. Thank you for that. Um, no pain, no gain. The effect of adding a pain stimulus to virtual training for police officers. This is a very interesting topic. I've discussed with Tim Pierce, AU Fire's neuromuscular stimulation kits that fully incapacitate limbs, which is great in reality-based training because not only uh, are the trainees inoculated to the stressful factors of potentially getting shot or any type of immobilization injury, but there's secondary and tertiary training opportunities such as cross draw, accurately firing, accurately returning fire, reloading with one hand, as well as tertiary, the medical side, right? Applying a tourniquet with one hand and controlling the situation. So I'm interested in what systems did you use, and what were your findings in a virtual reality environment versus reality-based training?
Yeah, so in this study, we used the Refence system
Mm-hmm.
from and collaborated here with Refence and the city police in Zurich. So we did a very large scale study for the first run of using a virtual reality system in their police agency. So we wanted to see here really how we can make virtual reality a little bit more multisensory.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in performing under pressure and in real life studies, we've seen that the yeah even the presence of threat can really have an influence on your behavioral responses as well as your physiological responses. So we've seen in real life studies that if you're shooting at a target that is also shooting back,
Mm-hmm.
you behave much differently. You take better cover. Your blinking
Mm-hmm.
rate is differently. Your reaction time is different. So we wanted to see if we would see stuff like this, but
Mm-hmm.
only on a physical and a psychological response in virtual reality training. So then, we used a stress belt. I think it's also
Okay.
I think it's Stress X belt is what it's called. So we used that. We had, I think, a little bit over 200 police officers come in and train in VR, either with the addition of this pain
Mm-hmm.
stimulus and the belt or without.
Mm-hmm.
And then we measured the same things as in the other studies, so the psychological training responses as well as the physical training responses, and we wanted to see whether that differs if the officers wear
Mm-hmm.
the pain stimulus or not. The scenario was a little bit different here. We had one large scale scenario. So first, all officers went into the fitting of the system calibration, and then also had a tutorial. Again, here, what I found really brilliant, what they did was replicate the training area that we had, or that the police had available to them in real life, so
Mm-hmm.
that the switch into the VR was immediate. So they knew already the layout. They knew the layout. They didn't have to get used to that anymore. But they're
Mm-hmm.
in this environment. They could open doors, use their weapon, communicate, so that they could get familiar with that. But they were not
Mm-hmm.
entirely thrown off by a new environment. So I thought that was a
Right.
really clever way
Mm-hmm.
to make a tutorial.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, they went into the scenario where they had basically a large 3-story building where they replicated one of the very large places in Zurich. So it really looked like you were in the city of Zurich where police officers operate. and there you would go into a bank and you would hear that there were two suspects that were armed in the bank, and there's a lot of yelling, sirens, phones going off, and the police officers had to find and arrest these suspects, and that was their task. And in this building there were 3 levels. The entry level, then we had an office floor, and on the top was residential buildings. One suspect was on the residential building taking another person hostage, and in the office building there was an active shooter situation. So they had to go through this really highly stressful scenario.
Yeah.
That took on average 12 minutes, I think. Yeah, so that was the scenario within that.
Interesting. So shock vest, pain stimulus.
Yeah.
Is it advantageous in a virtual reality setting? If not, what do you believe is an ideal setting for a pain stimuli?
So we found, interestingly enough, and I was a little bit shocked by this, that whether you wore or didn't wear the pain stimulus, you had no, like, the difference in training responses, there was none. And that was interesting for us to see, because we would have thought that at least perceived levels of stress or something like that would be higher, because you have this threat of receiving a pain stimulus. We didn't use it that much. So basically, this pain stimulus was elicited whenever the suspect would shoot one of the officers that was training. That didn't happen that often. But we've seen in real life research that even the threat of that being there would elicit higher responses. We didn't see that in the VR environment, interestingly. But we also only looked at the psychological and physical responses. I still believe that if we had looked at maybe behavioral responses, we might have seen something different. So I don't want to write it off completely just based on these findings. But even on more VR environment specific measures, sense of presence, immersion, on these levels, we didn't see a difference on whether wearing it or not wearing it would have influenced that. So yeah, that was still interesting, because also all participants were used to a pain stimulus from their other training practices, so they did know what it would feel like. Because we also thought, maybe that's the reason, they just don't know what it would do. But that's not a good enough reason for us to say that there was no influence of the pain stimulus.
Right.
I think there might be first other multisensory elements that could enhance VR training for these high pressure situations more. Our reason for it possibly not having an influence was that the stress level, we saw that the perceived stress levels were already so high that the addition of this pain stimulus might have not added anything on top of that. So there might be like a type of ceiling effect on perceived levels of stress that isn't going to be that isn't going to get any higher.
Right. Yeah, where once you hit that ceiling, additional stimulus wouldn't have an effect. And I wonder if that's also the limitations of the current technology in these shock vests as well. I think the more realistic these haptic suits and the physical feedback becomes, there might be a possible additional stress factor there.
I as I said, I'm still curious on the level of behavior. I think that would be really interesting to look into, because even if we see a difference there, it would already be worth implementing a pain stimulus. But I don't know yet.
Interesting. Further research.
Yeah.
All right. Can we move on to chapter 5?
Sure.
I think we've exhausted chapter 4. So changing perspectives, enhancing learning efficacy with the after action or the AAR in virtual reality training for police. And the AAR after action review, mission debriefing, hot washes, those always have been conducted post-operation or post-training. But I think the question is, how can we optimize an after action? And I'm curious about your findings, but from my experience with simulation systems, the value of the after action is the feedback that's presented as an objective information that really reinforces the reason why we're training in the first place. And whether that being data charts or video recorded feedback, it's objective perspectives and not the typical feedback from the instructor's experience, as well as their isolated perspectives. Yeah, so if you'd like to go into, chapter 5.
Yeah, exactly what you just said. I think whenever
Mhm.
I talk to police instructors about implementing VR, police instructors who've been using VR for a while now, they say one of the most important tools that they have available to them is the after action review, because what you
Mhm.
just mentioned, we have objective performance feedback. That's really hard and resource intensive, again, to gather in real life training.
Mhm.
And in VR, it's available to us like that. We can
Mhm.
have different performance metrics, how many shots were fired, how many shots hit the target, where did they hit. So just very like on a numeric level, we have performance metrics that already give us just a baseline, also maybe an indication of what we want to discuss during the after action review. But
Mhm.
in this study, we were particularly interested in the different perspectives that you can take in an after action review.
Mhm.
So in this particular system, we were able to, or we manipulated the replay perspectives. So for one, you can imagine after you come out of the scenario that I've just described,
Mhm.
you come out and we say, okay, we're going to review the scenario now from a bird's eye view. So we
Mhm.
just look at the entire scenario and you can see how you moved through the different office buildings, for instance, and how you interacted with your team members. Um, that's one perspective that we looked at.
Mhm.
And we looked at this bird's eye view in combination with the police officer perspective. So whenever they were moving through the building, it was from a bird's eye view, but as soon as there was contact with a perpetrator,
Mhm.
we would switch to the police officer perspective and what they
Mhm.
were seeing,
Mhm.
particularly the police officer who made contact verbally with the suspect and communicated with them. So we would review this particular interaction from the police officer perspective. That was the
Mhm.
second condition. And the third condition was also, again, the bird's eye view. But now, when we have the suspect interaction, we go into the suspect view. So we review the
Mm.
perspective on how,
Interesting.
like, we can see how the police officers behave themselves and they can see
Mhm.
themselves performing.
Mhm.
And that was quite interesting for them, I think, because this is a perspective they don't normally get. Um,
Right.
yeah, so that's what we did within the study.
Mhm.
In addition
Mhm.
to these perspectives, we also wanted to look at the function of turning on the sightline of the weapon. So in
Mhm.
an after action review, you can either turn it on or off, and then it's
Mhm.
on throughout the whole scenario, so you can see where all the weapons of the officers were pointing.
Mhm.
And we also wanted to see if that might have an influence on the learning efficacy of the police
Mhm.
officers. Maybe really quickly, by learning efficacy, I mean their perception of how well they can perform what they
Mhm.
learned in the training scenario in an operational setting. So we assessed that after they were done training and receiving the after action review, we had
Mhm.
a questionnaire with questions that were assessing, okay, how likely are you to perform what you just learned in an operational setting? And then they could rate very likely, unlikely.
Mhm.
And based on these responses, we calculated their learning efficacy. And
Mhm.
now we've seen that the actual side of like the sight line of the weapon didn't have an influence on the learning efficacy at all.
Mhm.
It wouldn't have mattered if we had turned it on or off. Yeah, I do
Is
think that might be a valuable tool
Mhm.
if this information would align with the learning outcome that was set for the training. So why do we
Mhm.
train? What do we want to learn? If
Right.
that had been in relation
Mhm.
to the sideline of the fire and that had been given valuable information to the trainees, then I do think that it would have impacted the
Mhm.
learning efficacy.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think especially if there was any type of eye tracking, what are you focusing on? What are you looking at? Where's your weapon pointed at? And and if there was a what, why, and how requirement for that, then
Yeah,
yes, that option is definitely um, valuable.
yeah,
All right, we've hit every chapter before the conclusion. With all of this in mind, how can VR, or I guess the first question is there value in agencies exploring options in integrating virtual reality into their training environments?
absolutely. I think
Mm-hmm.
we've seen in our research that VR can be a valuable training and learning tool, but it has to
Mm-hmm.
be implemented well, and it has to be
Mm-hmm.
implemented with the right intention, has to be implemented with care. And there's so many
Mm-hmm.
things that you need to consider before even starting to purchase some sort of VR product that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And that really needs to align with the gap that you're trying to fill in your real life training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then how can VR well, you're starting with understanding what training is, how these law enforcement agencies are training currently, rolling into running scenario-based trainings in real life and virtual reality, then to understand the additional stimulus, pain stimulus integration, and then after action. So how can VR training improve and supplement current police training practices?
Yeah. So we've looked at very different ratings. So we asked a lot of police officers as well as instructors and training coordinators, and we asked them, okay, what would you use VR for if you could?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that, particularly pertaining to training under pressure, is really this perception, action, decision making realm. So
Mm-hmm.
really using different environments to have officers train within it to see how they would react to different responses. So we expose them to as many situations as we can that are all different. I mean, we're never going to be able to replicate the operational situation that they might experience tomorrow, but
Mm-hmm.
we can send them in a lot of different situations, and they might be able to explore responses that work for them, and that they can transfer those over to operational
Mm-hmm.
situations that are new to them. So this is the realm that I see the most use for VR. I think there's also other areas, crime scene investigation, that are very useful, but within the performance under
Mm-hmm.
pressure, this perception, action, decision making realm is
Mm-hmm.
really where VR can do what real life training cannot really do,
Mm-hmm.
at least not do effectively and efficiently. So that is a big area where I see a lot of use for VR. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to read a couple of key points from the dissertation that answered this question in to reinforce what you're saying, right? So the first point is not reliant on the availability of standard training resources. In essence, training locations, facilities, props. Allows training to be conducted in a safe and controlled virtual environment, particularly for high risk situations like active shooter incidents or hostage situations, can simulate a variety of realistic training environments and avatars that are difficult to simulate in real life training, gives police a suitable alternative to fulfill training objectives aiming at decision making and acting, tactical procedures, and de escalation procedures, elicits psychological stress and requires police officers to cognitively engage in training, i.e., invest mental effort, and supplements real life motor skill training, in essence, shooting skills through a variety of scenarios that can simulate different contexts in which these skills have to be applied. So, moving to how can VR training be applied to enhance the training and learning experience of police officers?
Yeah, so obviously we've seen that there are many different tools that can be used. We can use external other multisensory tools to support the actual VR experience, such
Mm-hmm.
as a pain stimulus, but there are also other options that researchers are now trying to figure out to make it more, yeah, representative and realistic.
Mm-hmm.
That's one avenue. And then VR offers so many different manipulation options, whether that is in the before we even start the training. So in designing different training scenarios, we have already so many options to adjust our training in different ways. Then in action monitoring of the actual training, we can manipulate objects, people, communication, locations on the fly in response to what the officers are doing,
Mm-hmm.
which we can't really easily do in real life training, which I think is really one also of the biggest advantages of VR. And then the after action review. Yeah, you finally have the time to
Mm-hmm.
reflect objectively, maybe with another person with your team at your performance. And there you can gain, yeah, so much information that
Mm-hmm.
you normally wouldn't be able to in real life setting, or you could still with body cams, but just a little bit more complicated to do. So VR offers us a lot of options. And these things can be applied and adjusted based on the learning objectives that we have, the goal of training, what it is that we want to do. And the learning that comes out of this, I believe, is probably even like at a higher level than in real life training,
Mm-hmm.
because we can personalize so many things in VR, to the
Hmm.
skill level of the actual participants or police officers that we
Hmm.
train, and also to the situational factors that we might want to expose our officers to. And
Hmm.
that's, yeah, I get very excited about that part.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true because there's a huge advantage in the crawl, walk, run process, and the cognitive load or the limitations of short-term memory to long-term memory, the ability to um, repetitively hit key situations and run through your rules of engagement and your standard operating procedures, and then increase the complexity and recur training to ensure that lessons learned, whether it's the knowledge, the skills, or behaviors, reaches that long-term memory, and then is tested in whatever cadence, whether that be annually, quarterly, to ensure that these perishable skills aren't lost. Um, so yeah, to read a couple more of your points within your dissertation to reinforce this question. Is cognitively demanding and elicits significant levels of perceived stress and sense of presence without additional multisensory factors such as a pain stimulus, enables flexible maximization of germane load, i.e., cognitive load needed to process learning relevant information by creating diverse training contexts and scenarios, enables instructors to use a variety of objective feedback features in the after action review, enables instructors and trainees to review the training performance from a variety of perspectives, such as the bird's view, suspect's perspective, or law enforcement, police officer's perspective, offers various objective performance indicators such as line of fire, snail trails, and locations of shots fired. So great
Sounds
conversation.
great.
I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy doing the Lord's work. Um, uh, last question.
Yeah.
What does the future hold for Lisanne, and what's on the horizon for VR simulation research?
For myself, well, I'm just happy and curious to continue work on VR in simulation, like in any type of, yeah, high performance setting.
Mhm.
Police is, I've worked 5 years now within police, and that's been really great. And I'd love to continue that. Also branching out a
Mhm.
little bit into military and other sport
Mhm.
domains. Um, so I will hopefully continue to do that. I'm quite
Mhm.
sure that that's the route that I will take.
Mhm.
I have a lot of fun with it, so that will
Yeah.
be that. For VR, I think now with the rise in AI, we might be able to further support learning
Mhm.
active tools within the actual environments, whether that be
Mhm.
with or through eye tracking. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and in different ways, how we can utilize AR in virtual environments, AI in
Mhm.
virtual environments to, yeah,
Mhm.
further our training and also the learning process of, yeah,
Mhm.
officers, military, whoever it is that trains in these environments. So I think we'll
Yeah.
we'll get into that rather soon.